Welcome to session 4 of our study on the Apocrypha. In this session, we continue the Third Book of Maccabees with chapters 3, 4, and 5. In chapter 2, we saw the king of Egypt, Ptolemy IV Philopator, was humiliated when he attempted to walk into the inner sanctuary of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Upon his return to Egypt, he determined to take vengeance on the Jews. He altered their legal status and attempted to get them to worship the Greek god Dionysus. In the coming chapters, those Jews who attempted to resist will be herded together to be registered, tortured, and put to death. Divine intervention will save the Jews, but then Ptolemy decides to turn drugged elephants on the Jews. Before we get to chapter 3 of Third Maccabees, however, we're going to talk some more about the wisdom literature that can be found in the Apocrypha. But first, we open with a prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. 4 of the books in the Apocrypha are considered to be wisdom literature. In our Old Testament, there are 3 wisdom books: Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes. If you will recall, Proverbs is mostly a collection of wise sayings designed to guide young people through their daily lives. A gentle answer turns away anger, but a harsh word stirs up wrath. Or, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Fools despise wisdom and discipline. A joyful heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit dries up bones. The story of Job deals with the question of why good men suffer. Why do bad things happen to good people? Ecclesiastes is the story of someone looking back at life and wondering what it has all meant. There is a time for everything under the heavens, a time to be born, a time to die, a time for tearing down, a time for building up. We know these words even if we don't fully understand them. The wisdom of Solomon from the Apocrypha purports to have been written by King Solomon, although more likely it was written in the late 1st century b.c.e. or in the early 1st century CE. In many ways, it sounds similar to Proverbs. It contrasts the life of the just with the life of the wicked. It is written as though to the kings or rulers of the world. There is a promise to reveal the mysteries of wisdom to the reader. Solomon, the implied author, describes his life in quest for wisdom and the benefits that wisdom is able to bestow. Wisdom, described as Lady Wisdom, was with God at the creation and is available to those who seek her. The other primary book of wisdom in the Apocrypha is titled Ecclesiasticus, or the wisdom of Jesus, son of Seresh, usually referred to simply as Seresh. This book was originally composed in Hebrew, unlike most of the books of the Apocrypha. The author identifies himself as Jesus, son of Eleazar, son of Seresh. He conducted a school for prospective scribes and sages, maybe in conjunction with the Jerusalem temple complex. It was the author's grandson who produced the Greek version in Egypt in 117 BCE. Seresh is the largest wisdom book that we have from antiquity. It provides a window into life in ancient Israel at a pivotal point in Jewish history, illustrating how and what Jewish wisdom teachers taught. Ben Sirach gives his opinion on such topics as creation, death, fear of the Lord, friendship, happiness, and honor and shame. Baruch is a mixture of different types of literature. There are elements of historical and devotional writing in Baruch, but it also includes a wisdom poem that takes up most of chapter 3 and part of chapter 4. Wisdom personified as a woman is elusive but known to God, who gives her to Israel as the Torah. It is similar to Suresh and to Job in places, with its focus on exhorting Israel to learn wisdom. The fourth book of Maccabees is intended as a philosophical demonstration of the popular maxim that reason is able to master the passions, with added dimension that Torah observance provides the most effective training to achieve that goal. This generally fits the definition of wisdom literature. We'll talk more about some of the other books of the Apocrypha in our next session, primarily the histories and the devotional or hymn-like writings. But now we begin with the third chapter of the book of Maccabees. We remember the first two chapters. Ptolemy Philopator, the king of Egypt, defeated Antiochus the Great in Syria and Raphaea in southern Palestine. As part of his post-victory tour, Ptolemy visited Jerusalem, where he attempted to enter the Holy of Holies in the temple against the council of the Jewish priests and was paralyzed by God. After recovering and returning to Egypt, Ptolemy sought retribution against the Jews. So verse 1, chapter 3. When the impious king comprehended this situation, he became so infuriated that not only was he enraged against those Jews who lived in Alexandria, but was still more bitterly hostile toward those in the countryside. And he ordered that all should be promptly be gathered into one place and put to death by the most cruel means. While these matters were being arranged, a hostile rumor was circulated against the people by some who conspired to do them ill, a pretext being given by a report that they hindered others from the observance of their customs. The Jews, however, continued to maintain goodwill and unswerving loyalty toward the dynasty. But because they worshiped God and conducted themselves by his law, they kept their separateness with respect to foods. For this reason, they appeared hateful to some. But since they adorned their style of life with the good deeds of upright people, they were established in good repute with everyone. Nevertheless, foreigners paid no heed to the good conduct of the people, which was common talk among all. Instead, they gossiped about the differences in worship and foods, alleging that these people were loyal neither to the king nor to his authorities, but were hostile and greatly opposed to his government. So it was no ordinary reproach that they attached to them. So there seems to be a distinction between Jews in Alexandria and the Jews in the countryside. The odd emphasis on Jews from the countryside may reflect a historical attempt by Ptolemy to take a census of Jews in rural areas. Some scholars think Third Maccabees was written by a Jew from the countryside. His Greek is less sophisticated than that of Alexandrian Jews such as Philo. The dietary laws of the Jews was clearly a source of some of the barriers between Jews and Gentiles. Let's go on with verse 8. The Greeks in the city, though wronged in no way when they saw an unexpected tumult around these people and the crowds that suddenly were forming, were not strong enough to help them, for they lived under tyranny. They did try to console them, being grieved at the situation and expected that matters would change, for such a great community ought not be left to its fate when it had committed no offense. And already some of their neighbors and friends and business associates had taken some of them aside privately and were pledging to protect them and to do everything in their power to help. The Alexandrian Greeks were considered an elite cultivated class in distinction from those of other races. Ptolemy, the king, and his friends were Greeks. The Alexandrian Greeks were bitter enemies of the Jews in the Roman period of the late 1st century, but our author portrays a relationship of support and respect between these two groups. Let's go on with verse 11 through the end of the chapter. Then the king, boastful of his present good fortune, and not considering the might of the supreme God, but assuming that he would persevere constantly in his same purpose, wrote this letter against them. King Ptolemy Philopator, to his generals and soldiers in Egypt and all its districts, greetings and good health. I myself and our government are faring well. When our expedition took place in Asia, as you yourselves know, it was brought to a conclusion according to plan by the gods' deliberate alliance with us in battle, and we considered that we should not rule the nations inhabiting Coelesyria and Phoenicia by the power of the spear, but should cherish them with clemency and great benevolence, gladly treating them well. And when we had granted very great revenues to the temples and the cities, we came on to Jerusalem and went up to honor the temple of those wicked people who never ceased from their folly. They accepted our presence by word, but insincerely by deed, because when we proposed to enter their inner temple and honor it with magnificent and most beautiful offerings, they were carried away by their traditional arrogance and excluded us from entering. But they were spared the exercise of our power because of the benevolence that we have toward all. By maintaining their manifest ill will toward us, they became the only people among all nations who hold their heads high in defiance of kings and their own benefactors, and are unwilling to regard any action as sincere. But when we arrived in Egypt, victorious, accommodated ourselves to their folly and did as was proper, since we treat all nations with benevolence. Among other things, we made known to all our amnesty toward their compatriots here, both because of their alliance with us and the myriad affairs liberally entrusted to them from the beginning. And we ventured to make a change by deciding both to deem them worthy of Alexandrian citizenship and to make them participants in our regular religious rites. But in their innate malice, they took this in a contrary spirit and disdained what is good, since they incline constantly to evil. They not only spurn the priceless citizenship, but also both by speech and by silence they abhor those few among them who are sincerely disposed toward us. In every situation, in accordance with their infamous way of life, they secretly suspect that we may soon alter our policy. Therefore, fully convinced by these indications that they are ill-disposed toward us in every way, we have taken precautions so that if a sudden disorder later arises against us, we shall not have these impious people behind our backs as traitors and barbarous enemies. Therefore, we have given the order that as soon as this letter arrives, you are to send to us those who live among you together with their wives and children, with insulting and harsh treatment, and bound securely with iron fetters to suffer the sure and shameful death that befits enemies. For when all of these have been punished, we are sure that for the remaining time the government will be established for ourselves in good order and in the best state. But those who shelter any of the Jews, whether old or children or even infants, will be tortured to death with the most hateful torments together with their families. Any who are willing to give information will receive the property of those who incur the punishment, and also 2,000 drachmas from the royal treasury, and will be awarded their freedom. Every place detected sheltering a Jew is to be made unapproachable and burned with fire, and shall become useless for all time to any mortal creature. The letter was written in the above form. At the beginning of the letter, Ptolemy is somewhat boastful. He suggests that we should not rule the nations inhabiting Coelesyria and Phoenicia by the power of the spear. That's probably an indication that he was unable to defeat them in battle. He then describes his experience in Jerusalem, in which he was unable to enter the temple. We note that Alexandrian citizenship normally entailed participation in Greek religious ceremonies, but Alexandrian Greeks complained that the Jews wanted the privileges of citizenship, but were unwilling to fulfill the religious obligations. So Ptolemy has a plan to deal with them. He even offers incentives to turn Jews in, as well as penalties for sheltering them. We're going to go on to chapter 4 now, and I'm going to read the first 10 verses. In every place, then, Where this decree arrived, a feast at public expense was arranged for the nations with shouts and gladness, for the inveterate enmity that had long ago been in their minds was now made evident and outspoken. But among the Jews there was indescribable mourning, lamentation, and tearful cries and groans. Everywhere their hearts were burning, and they groaned because of the unexpected destruction that had suddenly been decreed for them. What district or city or what habitable place at all, or what streets were not filled with mourning and wailing for them? For with such a harsh and ruthless spirit were they being sent off all together by the generals in every city, that at the sight of their unusual punishments, even some of their enemies, perceiving the common object of pity before their eyes, reflected the uncertainty of life and shed tears at the most miserable expulsion of these people. For a multitude of gray-headed old men, sluggish and bent with age, was being led away, forced to march at a swift pace by the violence with which they were driven in such a shameful manner. And the young women who had just entered the bridal chamber to share married life exchanged joy for wailing, their myrrh-perfumed hair sprinkled with ashes, and were carried away unveiled, all together raising a lament instead of a wedding song, as they were torn by the harsh treatment of foreign nations. In bonds and in public view, they were violently dragged along as far as the place of embarkation. Their husbands, in the prime of youth, their necks encircled with ropes instead of garlands, spent the remaining days of their marriage festival in lamentation instead of feasting and youthful revelry, seeing Hades already lying at their feet. They were brought on board like wild animals, driven under the constraints of iron bonds. Some were fastened by the neck to the benches of their boats. Others had their feet secured by unbreakable fetters. And in addition, they were confined under a solid deck, so that with their eyes in total darkness, they would undergo treatment befitting traitors during the whole voyage. We read of the enmity of the native-born Egyptians for the Jews. Many of the Jews were brought from the countryside to Alexandria. Alexandria is on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, northeast of Cairo. They could have been brought by boat along the coast of the Mediterranean or along one of the tributaries of the Nile. In any event, it was not a pleasant journey. So we go on with verse 11. When these people had been brought to the place called Shaddai, and the voyage was concluded as the king had decreed, he commanded that they should be enclosed in the hippodrome that had been built with an immense perimeter wall in front of the city, and that was well suited to make them an obvious spectacle to all coming back into the city and to those from the city going out into the country, so that they could neither communicate with the king's forces nor in any way claim to be inside the circuit of the city. And when this had happened, the king, hearing that the Jews' compatriots from the city frequently went out in secret to lament bitterly the ignoble misfortune of their kindred, ordered in his rage that these people be dealt with precisely the same fashion as the others, not omitting any detail of their punishment. The entire people was to be registered individually, not for the hard labor that has been briefly mentioned before, but to be tortured with the outrages that he had ordered, and to the end to be destroyed in the space of a single day. The registration of these people was therefore conducted with bitter taste and zealous intensity from the rising of the sun until its setting, coming to an end after 40 days, but still not completed. Shaddai is a promontory about 3 miles from Alexandria. The hippodrome, referred to in verse 11, was a large arena. It implied here that the Jews living in Alexandria had been thus far unmolested, but when the king heard that they had been complaining and lamenting, he included the Alexandrian Jews in the torture and punishment. We read verse 16 through the end of the chapter. The king was greatly and continually filled with joy, organizing banquets in honor of all his idols, with a mind alienated from truth, and with a profane mouth, praising speechless things that are not even able to communicate or to come to one's help, and uttering improper words against the supreme God. But after the previously mentioned interval of time, the scribes declared to the king that they were no longer able to take the census of the Jews because of their immense number, though most of them were still in the country, some still residing in their homes, and some at the place. The task was impossible for all the generals in Egypt. After he had threatened them severely, charging that they had been bribed to contrive a means of escape, he was clearly convinced about the matter. When they said and proved that both the papyrus and reeds they used for writing had already given out. But this was an act of the invincible providence of him who was aiding the Jews from heaven. Verse 16 talks about the king praising speechless things. This refers to his idols. In a similar vein, Psalm 115 says, "Their idols are silver and gold, the work of human hands. They have mouths, but they do not speak. They have ears, but they do not hear. They have noses, but they do not smell. They have hands, but they do not feel. And they have feet, but they do not walk. They make no sounds in their throats." The scribes complained that they were unable to take a census of the Jews because of their immense number. This was obviously hyperbole. There were a large number of Jews, but not so many that they couldn't be counted. Let's go on with chapter 5, verses 1 through 9. Then the king, completely inflexible, was filled with overpowering anger and wrath. So he summoned Hermon, keeper of the elephants, and ordered him on the following day to drug all the elephants, 500 in number, with large handfuls of frankincense and plenty of unmixed wine, and to drive them in, maddened by the lavish abundance of drink, so that the Jews might meet their doom. When he had given these orders, he returned to his feasting, together with those of his friends and of the army who were especially hostile toward the Jews. And Hermon, keeper of the elephants, proceeded faithfully to carry out the orders. The officials in charge of the Jews went out in the evening and bound the hands of the wretched people and arranged for their continued custody through the night, convinced that the whole people would experience its final destruction. For to the nations it appeared that the Jews were left without any aid, because in their bonds they were forcibly confined on every side. But with tears and a voice hard to silence, they all called upon the Almighty Lord and ruler of all power, their merciful God and Father, praying that he avert the evil plot against them, and in glorious manifestation rescue them from the fate now prepared for them. So their entreaty ascended fervently to heaven. Hermon, the name of the elephant keeper, recalls the figure of Haman, the bad guy in the book of Esther, and his character may have been derived from Haman. Ptolemy had only 73 elements at the Battle of Raphaea that we read in session 3. 500 would be a gross exaggeration. So let's move on to verses 10 through 13. Hermon, however, when he had drugged the pitiless elephants until they had been filled with a great abundance of wine and satiated with frankincense, presented himself at court early in the morning to report to the king about these preparations. But the Lord sent to the king a portion of sleep, that beneficence that from the beginning, night and day, is bestowed by him who grants it to whomever he wishes. And by the action of the Lord he was overcome by so pleasant and deep a sleep that he quite failed in his lawless purpose and was completely frustrated in his inflexible plan. Then the Jews, since they had escaped the appointed hour, praised their holy God and again implored him who is easily reconciled to show the might of his all-powerful hand to the arrogant nations. King Ptolemy has a nice sleep, but the elephants seem to have missed out on their objective because the king slept too long and didn't wake up in time to give the order. So let's go on with verses 14 through 22. But now, since it was nearly the middle of the 10th hour, the person in charge of the invitations, seeing that the guests were assembled, approached the king and nudged him. And when he had with difficulty roused him, he pointed out that the hour of the banquet was already slipping by, and he gave him an account of the situation. The king, after considering this, returned to his drinking and ordered those present for the banquet to recline opposite him. When this was done, he urged them to give themselves over to feasting and to make the present portion of the banquet joyful by celebrating all the more. After the party had been going on for some time, the king summoned Hermon and with bitter threats demanded to know why the Jews had been allowed to remain alive through the present day. But when he, with the corroboration of the king's friends, pointed out that while it was still night, he had carried out completely the order given him, the king, possessed by savagery worse than that of Phalaris, said that the Jews were benefited by today's sleep. But, he added, tomorrow, without delay, prepare the elephants in the same way for the destruction of the lawless Jews. When the king had spoken, all those present readily and joyfully with one accord gave their approval, and all went to their own homes. But they did not so much spend the duration of the night in sleep as in devising all sorts of insults for those they thought to be doomed. Verse 20 refers to Phalaris. He was a tyrant in Sicily from 557 to 554 BCE, whose cruelty was proverbial. The king here has said that the Jews got lucky today, but wait until tomorrow. Let's go on in verses 23 to 35. Then, as soon as the cock had crowed in the early morning, Hermon, having equipped the animals, began to move them along in the great colonnade. The crowds of the city had been assembled for this most pitiful spectacle and were eagerly waiting for daybreak. But the Jews, being at that very moment at their last gasp, stretched their hands toward heaven and with the most tearful supplication and mournful dirges implored the supreme God to help them again at once. The rays of the sun were not yet shed abroad, and while the king was receiving his friends, Hermon arrived and invited him to come out, indicating that what the king desired was ready for action. But he, on receiving the report and being struck by an unusual invitation to come out, since he had been completely overcome by incomprehension, inquired what the matter was for which this had been so zealously completed for him. This was the act of God, who rules over all things, for he had implanted in the king's mind a forgetfulness of the things he had previously devised. Then Hermon and all the king's friends pointed out that the animals and the armed forces were ready, O king, according to your eager purpose. But at these words he was filled with an overpowering wrath because of the providence of God. His whole mind had been deranged concerning these matters. And with a threatening look he said, if your parents or children were present, I would have prepared them to be a rich feast for the savage animals instead of the Jews, who give me no ground for complaint and have exhibited to an extraordinary degree of full and firm loyalty to my ancestors. In fact, you would have been deprived of life instead of these were it not for the affection arising from our common upbringing and lifelong association. So Hermon suffered an unexpected and dangerous threat, and his eyes wavered and his face fell. The friends, one by one, sullenly slipped away and dismissed the assembled people to their own occupations. Then the Jews, on hearing what the king had said, praised the manifest Lord God, King of kings, since this also was his aid that they had received. So God has deranged the king's mind so that he doesn't seem to know what is going on. He reversed course and condemned the elephant keeper. Let's go on. The king, however, reconvened the banquet in the same manner and urged the guests to return to their celebrating. After summoning Hermon, he said in a threatening tone, how many times, you wretched man, must I give you orders about these things? Equip the elephants now once more for destruction of the Jews tomorrow. But the kinsmen, who were at the table with him, wondering at his instability of mind, remonstrated as follows. O king, how long will you put us to the test, as though we are idiots, ordering now for a third time that they be destroyed, and again revoking your decree in the matter? As a result, the city is in a tumult because of its expectation. It is crowded with mobs of people and also in constant danger of being plundered. At this the king Phalaris in everything, and filled with madness, took no account of the changes of mind that had come about within him for the protection of the Jews. And he firmly swore an irrevocable oath that he would send them to Hades without delay, mangled by the knees and feet of the animals, and would also march against Judea and rapidly level it to the ground with fire and spear, and by burning to the ground the temple inaccessible to him, would quickly render it forever empty of those who offered sacrifices there. Then the friends and kinsmen departed with great joy, and they confidently posted the armed forces at the places in the city most favorable for keeping guard. So again, Ptolemy reverses himself and orders the elephant attack on the Jews. Let's go on, verse 45. Now when the animals had been brought virtually to a state of madness, so to speak, by the very fragrant draughts of wine mixed with frankincense, and had been equipped with frightful devices, the elephant keeper entered the court around dawn, the city now being filled with countless masses of people crowding their way into the hippodrome, and urged the king to the matter at hand. So he, when he had filled with his impious mind with a deep rage, rushed out in full force along with the animals, wishing to witness with invulnerable heart and with his own eyes the grievous and pitiful destruction of the aforementioned people. When the Jews saw the dust raised by the elephants going out at the gate by the following armed forces, as well as by the trampling of the crowd, and heard the loud and tumultuous noise, they thought this was their last moment of life, the end of their most miserable suspense, and giving way to lamentation and groans, they kissed each other, embracing their relatives and falling into one another's arms, parents and children, mothers and daughters, and others with babies at their breasts who were drawing their last milk. Nevertheless, when they considered the help that they had received before from heaven, they prostrated themselves with one accord on the ground, removing the babies from their breasts, and cried out in a very loud voice, imploring the ruler over every power to manifest himself and be merciful to them, as they stood now at the gates of Hades. The Jews once again prepare to be trampled by elephants, even as they prayed to God. Is it all over for the Jews, or will God again come to the rescue? The Jewish historian Josephus tells a similar story about Ptolemy VIII Eugetes II Physcon, who reigned from 144 to 117 b.c.e. Part of the story about Ptolemy's seizure or shaking after entering the inner sanctuary of the temple seems to be borrowed from the second Maccabees stories of Helidorius and Antiochus. Hermon may have been borrowed from Haman in the book of Esther. So yeah, the whole story sounds a little bit contrived, but we told you this was fiction. It's a story about how God takes care of his people, even in the diaspora. So stay tuned. In our next session, we'll read the final 2 chapters of the Third Book of Maccabees. We'll hear the prayer of Eleazar and learn the fate of the Jews and of Ptolemy as well. Our next Zoom discussion session will be Monday at 6:30 p.m. If you would like to participate, don't forget to let me know. You can send an email to online.classes@northgateumc.org, and I will send you the Zoom link. Have a good week.